watch the hockey game tonight?
Yeah. That's fine.
Yeah, it's pretty first night. It's been a busy day for me. I was at high school. I did 4-hour and 15-minute talks of grade 10 students, so my voice is just about dead now, but I do have enough voice left to introduce our speaker. And, so we're really happy to have Doug Hunter here. My name is Ken Urban. I'm the Education Coordinator at Guelph Museums, and I'd also like to thank the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada for their partnership in our series. And before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that this place we call Guelph has served as traditional lands and a place of refuge for many peoples over time, but more specifically the Adirondack and the Haudenosaunee. This land is held as treaty lands and territory with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Guelph lies directly adjacent to the Halton Tract and is part of a long-established traditional hunting ground for the Six Nations of the Grand River. Many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who have come from across Turtle Island call Guelph home today. Guelph Museums continues to build our knowledge and relationships about the land, its history, and its people. This commitment informs all that we do at Guelph Museums. Now, it's a great pleasure to introduce Doug, our speaker tonight. Doug is the author of more than 20 works of nonfiction. He has been a winner and finalist of Canada's National Business Book Award and a finalist for the Governor-General's Literary Award, the Writers' Trust Nonfiction Prize, the Defoe Book Prize, and the Wilson Prize in Canadian History. He also holds a PhD in History from York University, and we're really glad to have him come out tonight on a cold winter night, so thanks for coming.
Among the many books I did, there was about 6 about hockey when I was driving down. What kind of idiot drives 2.5 hours on the night of the biggest game in hockey in 20 years? But I don't think, I think it's 8, so first they gotta boo each other's anthems.
First round of fights.
Then there's 3 fights. Trump's got to come out and say it's got to be done by 10:30 because I'm invading New Brunswick, and then maybe 8:45 the game will get going. So I think you want me to speak for 45 minutes, and I'm actually going to start till 3 to warm myself.
We don't have a timer. So
Okay, all right, good, because I'll run off. This is. I've given a lot of talks on this book, but I've never given it a talk from the perspective of the war, which sounds weird, but really my audiences are usually around art history. And my background actually is, my first run through school was painting and drawing and art history. And I've had a long career as a commercial artist as well as a writer. So I've been talking a lot about art, so I had to go back through, the presentation, and I'm like, take all these paintings and stuff out and think more about the war aspect of the story. So, and I don't like scripting, so I am going to freestyle my way through this, and hopefully I won't tell you not nearly as much art as you wish you had about, and maybe not too much more that you thought you weren't going to hear about. So, but to set things up, maybe we'll go to the title first. So, Jackson's Wars, A.Y. Jackson, the birth of the Group of 7 and the Great War. So I remember my editor at McGill Queens, when we got all the way through the edit, we were doing the book. It's like, okay, what's the cover? What's the title? And I was pretty adamant that I was going to give a sub-heading. He said, well, okay. He said, why is it Jackson, then the Group of 7, and then the war? Because the Group of 7, the first show was 1920, and the war is 1914-19. Why isn't that the other way around? And I said, well, because in the story, the group really forms. It's really there by 1913. It's there, and it's the key figures have come together, including Jackson. It's really ready to launch. And if it weren't for the war, we probably would have had a group of something in probably 1915 or maybe 1916. So on the art side of things, one of the large premises of this book is that the movement of the group, and when I talk to people, if anybody knows anything about Canadian art, or even knows nothing about Canadian art, they at least know there's this thing called the Group of 7. So a lot of the thrust of this was to say, especially with Jackson, there was a world and a life before 1920. Jackson actually was the most accomplished of any of them. He was 38 when they had their first show, which is not old for an artist, but still, he'd done a lot, and I'll cover a little bit of this as we go. But they had coalesced by 1912, 1913 in Toronto, and the movement was ready to happen. They kind of worked out the forms They kind of had their objectives down pat. The composition of the people was not going to be the same, mainly because Tom Thompson wasn't going to make it to 1920. But the process had happened, and they were ready to go. And then this thing called World War I comes along. It's going to greatly affect these people as individuals. It's really going to affect Jackson because he's the only soldier among them who actually goes out and is in combat, and we will get to that. So that's my preamble. So a little bit background about Jackson, because I'm telling you about Jackson, I don't know how much you know. Well, Jackson was one of the boys, as I said. He grew up in Montreal. This was the house he spent most of his time in. You can tell I was there at Halloween because there's ghosts and pumpkins around. This is across from Westmount High School. But Jackson, he was born in 1882 to a family of 6 kids. And when he was about 9 years old, he came home from school one day, and there were these strange men walking through the house with ledgers, kind of writing everything down as they went, and his mother was standing there sobbing, and Dad's nowhere to be seen. Well, Dad had fled the country because he was terrible with money, and he abandoned his family. He never saw his wife again. He moved to Chicago, and that left Georgina with 6 kids, among them including Jackson. So Jackson, at the age of 12, had to go to work. They had to support the family. They lived, this is when things were going a little better for them, but they lived in tougher parts of Montreal before that. But his brother was a very good commercial artist. One of his brothers, his older brother, Harry. And Jackson was supposed to go into the insurance business. That's what they had kind of figured out for him. But he got an opening at one of the lithography companies, and as an errand boy, message boy. And he started taking lessons in the evening. There were the Montreal, there's a manufacturers association where you could, basically night school courses you could go to for free. And you could learn plumbing and all these other things. And there was also art classes. And part of that was lithography. And by lithography, we're not talking high-end art. We're talking making ads for newspapers and catalogs and stuff, black and white drawings of shoes and mattresses. So Jackson learned a trade. He learned a trade, which was basically making catalog drawings. But unlike Harry, which is no judgment, Harry was a very good commercial artist, and he was actually a very good artist as well. He might have been a better artist than AY was. But AY wanted to be a painter. He was going to be a painter's painter, period. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to do landscape. So he set out to try to do that. He studied in Chicago in 1906. He went to Paris, as all the Canadians did, and studied at the Académie Julian. He lived in France for a couple years, traveling around painting. He came back, again, worked doing catalog stuff. And then he started meeting these Toronto artists around 1912. He started hooking up with people like J.H. MacDonald. He met Tom Thompson. Lord Harris was another one of these key people. So, and this is a critical painting from that time. If you're at the National Gallery, go have a look at it, because this is Jackson's Edge of the Maple Wood. It was shown in a big exhibition of Canadian art in England in 1910, and he got very good notices for it. The English notes just talked about it. It was full of crisp, clear Canadian light. And that actually became a real rallying cry for what the Group of 7 talked about. This is none of this muggy European, foggy, goopy sky stuff. Canadian light is, I don't think it's always like this. I mean, we get some pretty muggy, hazy days. But that was sort of the notion. And this painting was probably Jackson really at the peak of his game of doing, I don't know what you'd call impressionistic naturalism or naturalistic impressionism. He pretty well nailed it. And it was where do you go from here if you're going to go from anywhere but there. But he painted this, and I'll try to keep this part of the story really brief, but it was exhibited he entered it in the Ontario Art Association show in the spring of 1911. And it was the only time he entered at that point because he hated the show. He wrote a letter that said, basically, they hang your painting upside down and they forget to send you a catalog and then they ship it home to the wrong address. I'm never doing that show again. But one of the people that saw it was a young Toronto painter named Lord Harris. And Lord Harris was from the Massey Harris fortune. So Lauren really didn't have to worry about making ends meet, and he could paint all he wanted. And he loved this painting, and he bought it for, I think, about $400. And that's how he and Jackson connected. He sent the money through J.H. MacDonald, and then he was selling paintings in Toronto, and he was never able to sell anything in Montreal, and that's when he decided, you know, if I'm going to do anything, I got to go there. So he upped and moved to Toronto. And I'm throwing this in because we're doing a little bit of art here. This is a painting called Cedar Swamp, which I don't even think of cedars, and it's not a swamp. They painted it in the Eastern Townships in the spring of 1913. And this, I don't know if you pay a lot of attention to painting, but this is very naturalistic. This is starting to get kind of stylized. This is 1913. This painting is so predictive of what the group was going to do that Jackson would actually hang it in the second group show in 1921, 8 years later. And at the time he was doing this, he was exchanging letters with Lord Harris. He'd never even met the guy yet, but they were talking about Canadian art and what's it going to be and what should we do, and this idea of being, you know, a little more stylized, a little more graphic, you know, to get a truth of the sense of the place rather than, you know, absolute fidelity. So in this very strange way, these two people who had never met each other through letters kind of worked out the program. And then Jackson painted this, and this was the spring of 1913, and it really was, you know, he pretty well nailed what the group was going to do by himself, painting in the townships before he'd actually met the ones that would be with him. So fast forward through a bit of this, the members of this group start meeting. Okay, this is September. This is October. He went to Algonquin Park for the first time through the winter, actually, in 1914. But then a group of them got together in the park to paint. So in this famous picture, you'll see Tom Thompson smoking a cigarette. There's Fred Varley from England. He just came over in like 1912. Jackson's in the middle. Arthur Lismer, who had come from England about 1911. These two, Lismer and Varley were both in Leeds, commercial artists. And then Lismer's wife and daughter are there, and they're painting in the park. They are never going to be together like this again. This is the first and only time this group of people are going to be. These artists are going to be in the same place at the same time. And what's happened, of course, we're in October 1914. So what happened in August 1914? What happened in August 1914 was Jackson was in the Rocky Mountains painting, and he was walking a trail back into town, and one of the guides of the area said, well, what do you think about the war? And he's been literally up 6,000 feet up, and he said, what war? And they said, well, the whole world's at war. I mean, and he said, I just figured, I gotta go to town and get a newspaper. I gotta figure out what's going on. So Jackson figured out what was going on, and what Jackson figured out was, it's going to be over in 3 months. The whole thing is ridiculous. As soon as the British Army gets in, this is done. We don't have to worry about this thing. Thompson was much more cynical. He thought this is going to go on for years, and he had wanted nothing to do with it. Jackson had a very close painter friend, Randolph Houghton, in Montreal, who he was painting with in the spring with some of those paintings I showed you. And Randolph was very keen, and he enlisted right away. And was putting a lot of pressure on Jackson to go. Jackson's younger brother, Bill, who was kind of a celebrated local athlete, he signed up with the 14th Battalion right away, and off they went. And Jackson really wanted nothing to do with the war. I think he saw it as a just or necessary war. He really, you know, when we look at World War I, we tend to, sometimes we think the old, oh, what a lovely war, you know, lampoon of, it really was incredibly wasteful of human life and often really badly run. But people like Jackson really felt that Germany had to be contained. All other else, like this, there was justice to this thing, that the Kaiser had to be stopped. But he didn't want to stop him. He wasn't interested in stopping him. What changed it for Jackson was Second Ypres in April 1914. So I mean April 1915. So I don't know how many people know much military history. But April 1915, Second Ypres, the battle there was the first time Canadian troops were actually really in action. It was the first time the Germans used gas. It was the first time the Germans used flamethrowers. It was a widespread massacre. And Jackson was from Montreal. And he was out in the townships when Ypres happened, Second Ypres happened. And he wrote it in memoirs about, you know, getting a package, and the guy, you know, the guy says, oh, you know, big news from France. There's been this big battle, and his brother's been in it. Bill's been in it, And also for Montreal, Montreal at the time was the biggest city in the country. It was the most prosperous city in the country. The Golden Square Mile was full of these elite families, and all of these elite families had these, sons, like, the Drummonds and the Molsons, who had all gone in, a lot of them through McGill as officers, and they were mowed down like weeds at 2nd Ypres. So 2nd Ypres from Montreal was enormously traumatizing. If you look at the papers, as I did, you flip through the day by day, it is just pages and pages of dead and wounded. And what impressed me at the time, when you look at it, is that they're very detailed about what happened, like the wounds and the injuries and what has happened to people. It's not just, dead or wounded, it's like, head wound or something else. Like, so there's this non-stop flow in April of 1915 of trauma in Montreal. And Montreal decides it's going to raise another battalion called the 60th Battalion. It's an infantry battalion. And Jackson holds out until June. And at that point, he just, as he would say, he just couldn't live with himself anymore. He just couldn't look at himself. And so he signs up. He signs up as a private in the 60th Battalion. Now, at the time, Lord Harris, who's, wallowing in money, his younger brother, his only brother, actually, had gone to England and entered officers training to go into the British Army. And Lauren said, I could do the same for you. Like, said, I'll pay. You can go to England. You go. And Jackson in this kind of touching but naive. No, I'm going to start at the bottom. I'm going to go right in at the, I know it is a private. I'm just going to, that's what I'm going to do. And Jackson, had a tremendous affection for the men he served with. I mean, he wasn't from anything special himself. But he just had a huge fondness for the people. And if you look at, as I did, if you look at if you get the records from the men who would sign up, those men were, they were common laborers. They weren't doctors and lawyers. Nobody in that kind of position ever went in at a private's level. They went and got a commission somehow. So, they really are salt of the earth. And frankly, a lot of them are there probably because they need a job. Because Canada just come through a pretty stiff depression in 1912-13. So not everybody was into the army because they wanted to go off and defeat Germany. But it was an interesting slice of life that he joined. And there was about 1,000 of them that formed this battalion and went off. So one of the things I did when I was working on it was I was in this kind of race with Library and Archives Canada because they'd started to digitize the records of soldiers in the First World War. And I'd used those records before on other books, but it was always, go to the Ottawa, requisition the boxes, get the record I wanted. We were talking about 1,000 people. I mean, that's just completely impractical. You'd never be able to do it. But when I had a list of everybody who was in the regiment from 1915, and then there was this online tool, I could start pulling every record there was. And I have to emphasize to Canadians that our records from the First World War are really extraordinary. They're very detailed in most cases. I had 2 grandfathers that were in the First World War. One was Scottish, one was English. I know virtually nothing about what they did. Because 2/3 of the records, I think, in British Army records from the First World War were destroyed in the Second. So there's huge, huge gaps. And if you're writing history, Canadian history, and you're writing on the First World War, it's a luxury almost of how much material you can pull. And I started pulling this material, and as an aside, it was a very interesting process because, you'd find, oh, well, that's who I want. I found the guy, you'd hit the download file, and then sometimes it was going to be 30 pages. Sometimes it was going to be 110. And it kind of got to a pattern where I kind of felt this, if you hit it was 30, it's like, he didn't make it. I just knew before I started reading, this guy's not going to be in this, this story's going to be pretty brief. This is going to be a KIA like in 1916. 110, this guy's got big medical problems. This medical file is going to go on forever and ever and ever. And they do, because there were no antibiotics. There were records of people I looked at who were they had bone-deep wounds in their foot that you could just never get rid of the infection, so they're back in hospitals in Montreal. In like 1919, they're still having them treated. And the other thing I wanted to do was sort of map out, well, what happened with these guys in the war? How did it go for them? So, as I said, I was in a bit of a race with LIC because they were digitizing through the alphabet, and I was kind of coming right in behind them. And they kind of gotten to W, and I had gotten to P. But what I was doing is, Jackson was in A Battalion. So that's about, there was probably 250 to 300 people in the battalion. There's 4 battalions in this regiment. And when I hit P, I was at 200. And that had taken me more than a month. I was supposed to be writing an art book, and here I was, doing these guys. And I thought, that's a pretty good sample. I'm probably at 60, 75% of the regiment. So then I started going through every one of those files, and I started, I set up a spreadsheet, and I started putting in what happened to them, what were the nature of their wounds, were they killed in action. There's a few deserters. There was actually one guy in the regiment who was shot for desertion during the Somme, and I found out in the ultimate bureaucratic phrasing, when you are shot for desertion, your cause of death is death by commanding officer. That's how they put it. Your commanding officer had you shot. So, but of the rest, what happened to them? Well, the numbers were 45% of these men had what was called a GSW, which was short for gunshot wound, but was anything metallic. That was a bullet, that was shrapnel, that was just flakes of metal flying through the air. 45%. Because they're foot soldiers, they're infantry. 17% had something that was either shell shock or neurasthenia, which was about pretty much the same thing. You're mentally scrambled, and you've actually got a diagnosis, and you're out of combat because of that. And at the time, medicine and the army understood that these men were mentally in a lot of trouble. You can just read their records of their trembling and their nightmares and their sweating and their heart rates, but they didn't know what it was caused by, or they thought it had a cause, and they thought it was something physiological. It was called shell shock because they literally thought the shock wave of the shell was causing causing an impact on their brain. They didn't see it as just a cumulative trauma of this constant shelling, this constant loss of comrades. This exposure to this endless stress would cause these breakdowns. So to have 70% of them, diagnosed with shell shock was pretty impressive as to how many were actually in that condition. 16% were killed in action. So that's like 1 in 6. That's pretty high. Probably high as any war we're going to see. So a lot of them didn't make it through, and some of Jackson's friends, I'm kind of extemporizing a little bit here, but Jackson, one of his closest friends, was wounded. He thought he made it through the war. He was wounded like not even a week before the end of it, and he died 10 days after the end of it because he was hit by machine gun fire. There were others that were killed in action, in aircraft, and he lost a lot of people. And I can touch a little bit on that as we go, but that's sort of the. So before he goes, this is just one little art thing on the window. He painted this painting called Red Maple, which was done at the park, and it was sold as part of. There was an exhibition of. It was like a patriotic exhibition. They were sold in auctions, and J.H. MacDonald did the poster that you can see there on the right. And the funny thing I always found about Jackson is that despite being as famous as he is and as much as he's produced, Jackson doesn't really have a signature painting. I mean, he's not like, there's no West Wind, there's no Jack Pine like Thompson. That's what you talk about Jackson. To a lot of people, Red Maple is it. I think it's kind of okay. Jackson was pretty harsh on his own work. There's a great letter from him in the 1930s to the National Gallery, because they started collecting him about 1910, 11. And he went through the stuff they had, and there were things he wanted to take back and exchange for other stuff that he thought was better. So he gives this analysis of he uses words like, that's cheese, and they're still all there. They refused to do it. He thought Red Maple was passable. And I actually think he's right. I think it's okay. There's a sketch in McMichael, which I reproduced in the book, that that's a lot more vigorous. Jackson would talk about paintings how sometimes they painted the ginger went out of them. It was a very good term because what these artists often did was they go out into the field, they would do their sketches, but the sketches were like on 8 by 10 panels. So Thompson's famous for that. But then you were supposed to go into a studio and create a painting and translate the sketch into this big thing. Thompson, I think, really struggled with that, especially in his last year. And so in the process of translating this vigorous, quick thing he had done into this solemn work of art, sometimes they just kind of lost their zip. And I think Red Maple did. One of the things I realized, I think why Red Maple was popular and why he chose it was because the red maple was the insignia on the shoulder patch of so many of the regiments in Canada at the time. So there was a patriotic element to it, and why I put up, you can see the red maple, rolling through a bit of J.H. McDonald's posting as well. So I don't think it's accidental that that's what he chose to, donate to, and why it was sold and auctioned at the show. So this is Jackson who looks a lot older than he really was, but two photo portraits that were made of him in the summer of 1915 when he enlisted. Both these were quite well-known arts figures. Edmond Diana was a Montreal painter and teacher, was also quite a good photographer. Harold Moore-Rolland was a very respected art critic, who also was an ambitious art photographer. So they both did Jackson's portrait. So a couple quotes from Jackson. There's a lot of wonderful letters from Jackson. There's a lot in the book you can read, but I thought some of these were really good. I mean, the first, if you can't read them, I can tell you, a letter he wrote to his mother and said, "The front is a funny place. You'd think you were approaching a long steelworks. The flares, the flax, and the hammering and the machine guns." That's when he's first showing up, on the front. And he writes from a field station to his mother. He's on the Ypres salient. "Well, war in its present state is not very exciting. It's rather petty and quite uninspiring. You start off in the trenches in small parties at night, and the roads are shelled pretty regularly, mostly shrapnel. You never know just when a long whistling sound will rip the air, and then a bang and a lot of dirt will be shot up into the air a few feet away. It isn't a pleasant sensation. You have no cover of any kind, but I don't suppose more than one shell in 100 ever hits anything." So something that becomes very clear to Jackson in these, you go into their lines for about a week or 10 days, you come out again for a week or 10 days. He's assigned to a signal station, which is often well back in the lines at this time. And what Jackson figures out in not very much time is that whether you live or die in this industrialized, mechanized, atomizing war is completely capricious. It has nothing to do with heroics or how good a marksman you are. As he says in one letter, "I could just as easily be killed 2 miles back of the front, sitting in a signal station by German shelling, as I could 50 yards from the German front lines." It's totally random. It's absolutely random. And whatever he does is really not going to make any difference at all, whether he can make it through this thing or not. So Jackson has a fairly, not an easy time of it, but the regiment overall it doesn't do too bad until June, early June 1916. You can tell I never talk all day. What happens is the Battle of Mount Sorrel, and that's when the Germans, who hold most of the high ground around the Ypres salient, launch this massive assault on the lines, which are held by Canadians and British troops. And Jackson is called forward in the midst of this. His battalion is called forward in the midst of this assault, and he describes this in a very long letter to J.H. McDonald, which I had. And it's a remarkable letter of complete and utter cluster fudge chaos of troops trying to get forward, or the troops trying to get back, and they're getting trapped in the same trench, passageways, and the Germans are watching from aerial balloons and just shelling them as they go. Jackson watches and describes how there's a lieutenant from B Company, I think. Shell bursts overhead. He looks over the guy, turns gray, and drops dead right in front of him. Jackson hasn't got a mark on him. It's completely random. Who's going to make it, who doesn't? And Jackson, in the end, he there is a shell burst, and he takes a shrapnel in the hip, and then yeah. So this is actually in the McMichael. He nailed him home to his mother, and he lived at the McMichael for a few years of his life. And so the stuff is there. I just had a show at the McMichael. The McMichael Gallery for 6 months had a show called Jackson's Wars, based on the book and the paintings. And I was co-curating it, and I suggested, hey, you got this stuff in the basement. You should, let's put it in the show. And then so I came for the walkthrough, with the executive director, and I said, the stuff's not there. I said, why don't you bring it out? He said, well, we talked about it, and it felt like religious reliquary. We just didn't feel comfortable putting it up. And I wish it had, because, boy, this is what was in his hip. And he gets evacuated, and he goes to Tapley, which is this community on the coast of the Channel, and it was an artist colony before the war. In fact, Jackson lived there for quite a lot. So this bucolic artist colony was now this massive military base of medical facilities. And he was going back to where he had been before the war, when it was just sand dunes and, Blériot's airplane flying around and things like that to be treated. So when he gets there, he's x-rayed, and they find this, which is about a half-inch shrapnel ball, which he didn't even know it hit him, and it had gone into his shoulder about 3 inches, which speaks to the degree of shock that Jackson was in. His letters, a lot of his medical records are basically missing. Why is another story. But his letters home, he's clearly traumatized. He talks about the nightmares. He talks about the way he converses about the war at that point. You realize that he's really been badly damaged as a human being. And fundamentally, he doesn't want to go back to the front. He's been there, he's done that, and he knows, it's just a matter of time before this process kills me. But Jackson is a guy he's not sick enough to be sent home. He can't be, he's not bad enough you want to discharge him and send him back to Canada. And lots of soldiers were discharged and sent back to Canada. But he's also not well enough to send back to the front. He's just kind of in this limbo of every month there's a medical board review, and they look at you and go, nah, you stay here. So he was sorting mail, in these camps in England, biding his time, and every month there was this fear of, okay, well, if they pass me this time, I'm back to the front. And he really didn't want to have to go back to the front. Well, I'm at 30 minutes already. How about that? So we see some paintings. So after about a year, though, of this fear, he's rescued by art. Because, I'll get to this, but because Lord Beaverbrook, Max Aiken, who's in charge of everything in Canada and Britain with communication in the war, he sets up the Canadian War Memorials Fund, which is completely privately done. It's quasi-official, but Max is running it, and he's hiring artists. Canada needs, the British were sending war artists over, so Canada needs war artists too. The thing is, Beaverbrook didn't know anything about art, zero about art. The Beaverbrook Gallery exists because after the Second World War, he became an art collector. First World War, didn't know art from, pick something. But he had Paul Conati, who was a well-known critic in England, who was sort of helping him. And what he was basically doing was finding the best and the brightest of English artists and sending them to the front to paint Canadians. And this kind of, as you might expect, kind of got in people's craws. I'm going to compress this a lot, but the word got to Aiken that was, there's Canadians that can do this stuff. We do have artists. And in fact, there's one right now. He's sitting in a camp in England. He's not doing anything. So Aiken, Beaverbrook had him in, interviewed Jackson, had him back a second time, and said, make this man a lieutenant, because they all got honorary commissions, and sent him off to paint. And that saved Jackson from going back. The thing with Jackson was that unlike most of the artists, he was an actual soldier. He was still in the Canadian Army. And so one of his big worries progressively was that if he wasn't producing what the program wanted, he was really afraid they'd just send him back to the camp. He'd just go back to the regiment, go into the pool of, of replacements, and he'd be going back to the front again. So unlike virtually every other artist in the war art program, there were consequences for not producing what they wanted. And he couldn't figure out what they wanted, which was really hard, which really probably didn't help his mental health at all. So he went in 1917 they sent him to, of all things, to Passchendaele in October 1917, which was a muddy, bloody, 60,000 casualty disaster for Australians and New Zealanders and everybody else that was in the thing. Jackson couldn't get anywhere near the front because, surprise, surprise, there's a war on, so you can't just sit there with an easel, looking over the parapet, painting away. So he was driving around the backcountry, just kind of painting, things that actually looked just like landscapes. You wouldn't even know there was a war on, looking at a lot of those paintings. And there was also a real question of, well, what is war art even, like, what is it for? Why are we doing this? And there was a real schism in the Canadian side, because on the home front, you had ambitions for a Canadian program around Byron Edmund Walker, who was a major figure in art and philanthropy in Canada. And Walker's idea of war art was really just documentary. We should send some people, make some drawings, and they can go in a file, and then after the war, we can hire some people to make some really big paintings from them. Whereas probably the best thing that happened with Beaverbrook, because Beaverbrook knew nothing about art, and he had no ambitions that way. And he got somebody like Kanadi to go find him artists. And he did get the best of the best. And art at the time was, there was a movement in England called Vorticism, which Paul Nash, who was actually a soldier until he fell in a trench and hurt himself. And so Nash, this is very much more stylized. Nash was trying to capture what the experience of war was to the soldier, not a veritas sort of thing. Jackson talked about, what he called the cook-ups, which were the paintings that were, this is a good one, Kenneth Forbes, who was actually a Canadian soldier as well. He was injured in gas, but he painted. And this is depicting something that happened at the same time Jackson was wounded. The death of the Canadian officer of the Princess Pats. But this kind of group scene, get a lot of guys to pose, try to recreate it. Jackson called them cook-ups. He didn't find them very authentic. He talks about one, which I think is Richard Jackson's second Ypres painting. It's a huge painting in the wall. You can still see it there. And there's an officer with a bandage on his head pointing forward to the Germans, and there's crazed Germans trying to get at them. And well, there's no mustard, there's no gas anywhere. There's no flamethrowers. And as Jackson would say, if you look at the painting, you can see that face, and then that guy's over there, and he's there. And he's there. Because the artist had to get a model, and so he just kept painting the same guy all over the canvas. So Jackson knew he didn't want to do that, but he didn't know what he was going to do and why he was going to do it. And he had enough trauma that he was not going to paint the literal visceral horror of the war. He was not capable of doing it, and he didn't want to do this kind of thing. He wasn't going to do what Frederick Varley did. Varley was one of 4 Canadians that were sent over in a group. I always have to write these things down because my mental block and all names. Yeah, Fred Varley, Maurice Cullen from Montreal, Bill Beattie from Toronto, and Charles Simpson from Montreal. They all went over in early 1918 and then got their chance at the front. So Varley's painting, which is deservedly famous, is for what? And it's a cart full of body parts that somebody's burying in a muddy field. This is not a very romantic, portrait of war. And nobody was telling Varley what he could and could not paint, so this was Varley's response to the battle. Jackson really admired this painting, really admired what Varley did, but he could never do that himself. He just couldn't. He couldn't bring himself to do that kind of work. Did a lot of sketching, as I said. One of the problems is you can't stand there at an easel. He tried a few times and actually got shelled once. So to create paintings, what he had to do was do these drawings, and then he would put little notes about color. There's a couple down here. He'd say green or this kind of brown, and then he'd have to go back to his studio in London, and then he'd have to create a painting out of it, which was a process he had never done before, and people just didn't do either. So the only painting he got out of that first visit was actually based on a drawing he did in Ypres on the very last day he was there. I think it was one of his best efforts. His Houses of Ypres. And it's really faithful to the drawing. There's very little different, except in his drawing he says this is supposed to be blue, and he made them all green. He just decided to change the color. But that's about all he got out of that trip, out of all the paintings that you really thought was memorably worked. So he came back and he was really worried. He was like, Like, if this doesn't fly, I'm back in, I'm back in the line. Well, fortunately, he didn't go back in the line, and in March of 1918, he got to go back to the front again. And this time, he went in and around Levan, if I'm pronouncing that right, and he went into an area that was miles and miles and miles of nothing, because it had been fought over and recaptured, and you could look forever and not see a single human being, hear a bird, or anything. It was just destruction as far as the eye could see. This was actually one of his favorite paintings, Green Cross here. I think that's how you pronounce it. This is a slag heap. A lot of these battles were fought around industrial areas. And this was held by the Germans right until the end of the war. But he had a high ground view, and he painted this. And what Jackson did really well, I think, is what he figured out is that if I can show you the effect of the war on the landscape, I can give you a sense of what the war was like. People are very seldom in his paintings, in part because they just weren't around. He was looking at all this emptiness. And what he did interesting was he always had this kind of slightly elevated, not always, but most of the time, this slightly elevated view. So it was very high horizon, very little sky. And what Jackson shows you over and over again in the foreground and the middle ground is what the war has done. But what is almost always happening in the background is the war still going on. It's still churning away, still destroying, still consuming. And it has this ambiguity about it that's almost, you're not sure you're looking at weather or you're looking at human violence, especially in something like Green Cross here. I mean, is this shelling? Which I think it is, in the town. Or is this a storm? This is very much like a Georgian Bay thunderstorm, where he had painted before the war. He spent a long time up in Georgian Bay. So you have this ambiguity with Jackson a lot of the time. He uses the atmosphere that's partly human and partly, natural. City of Jeanne d'Arc is another great one. I put this up in the other exit talks because Jackson was a brilliant colorist. He could get color out of mud like nobody could. And when people talk about how great Tom Thompson was as a colorist, he was, but Thompson learned from Jackson. He shared a studio with Jackson. He painted with Jackson before he went away. As a little aside, too, Jackson, in the midst of those interviews with Beaverbrook, after the first one, he comes back to his camp, and there's a letter from home telling him that Thompson is just drowned. He's gone missing in the canoe accident. He can't believe this has happened. There's just wonderful letters from him talking about what they've lost in Thompson. But before that, there was a decided chill, I think, in their relationship because Jackson, in the end, went to war. And he was the only one of the group that did. But he was also the only one that wasn't married. And when I say the group, I'm talking about this circle of painters. Because there wasn't a group yet, but they had met. Except really Carmichael was single. But Carmichael was very young. He wasn't really part of the circle yet. He'd been studying in Belgium. When the war started, he just barely got out. But of that group, the other guys were married with kids. Thompson was single, and Hale and Hardy, and Jackson was single. Jackson goes to war. Thompson stays home and paints in the park. And there's a very interesting letter from Jackson to he's writing J.H. MacDonald from the camps in England when he's training before they get to the front. And he ends one of them with saying, "Give my regards to Lauren and Arthur." That's Arthur Lismer and Lauren Harris. Now, Arthur and Lismer they're both married, they both have children. And I read that letter and went, where's Tom? Tom was the guy he's been painting with. Tom was the guy that he had the studio with. He doesn't mention Tom Thompson. He never mentions Tom Thompson in the letters home. And so I think Thompson was very much, as his right to, was almost, as Varley said, a conscientious objector. He wanted nothing to do with the war. And there's a very interesting description from Harris, which Harris says how he would paint at a studio in Toronto. And he would be in there all day, and he only left at night. And he would go down into the Rosedale Valley at night and snowshoe over there through the valley. So he was always kind of below the ground of all the marching bands and the recruitment drives. He would stay in the studio and then he'd disappear into the forest at night. And then as soon as the weather was good, he was gone. He was up to the Concord Park. But when Thompson dies, it's devastating to Jackson. He really realizes we've lost something enormous here. And the grand old man of the movement is just not going to be around. The other thing that he had to struggle with was this strange seductive quality of violence it was actually kind of fun to watch. And this was a memorable night where he was with a major British artist, and they stood on a ridge watching a British gas attack on the German lines. And, you know, the flares or signals are going off in the distance, and the gas is billowing through here. And it was just this, it was like going to Victoria Day fireworks. And so Jackson knew enough about war that he knew what was happening, which was horrible. But it was also this fascinatingly beautiful thing, and he just had to paint it. And you see that in the artists working in and around the war over and over again. There's this terrible beauty that they can't turn their eyes away from, that they have to witness and want to witness. So I put this in because I'm going to show you the next slide. And actually I like this because it's actually darker in the image that I got from the War Museum. This is a painting. Jackson has a genius for these ironic little captions like springtime in Picardy, which is where he painted it as devastation war. The first one I showed you was a copse evening, and Maple Copse was where his battalion had his A company had its first casualty. His commanding officer was killed by shrapnel. He was hit by shrapnel. He took 30 minutes to die. They buried him in the mud. Nobody knows where he is. And so he paints the scene. He calls it a copse evening, which sounds very bucolic and isn't going to be pretty. No, this is a horrible place. So he paints this. So I had this real deja vu with this painting. I'd seen it, and then I watched this. Anybody see this movie?
1977.
Walking through a broken wall with cherry blossoms. Two soldiers about to walk through a wall with cherry blossoms. I actually wrote the director. Said, "Did you ever see this painting?" And Sam Mendes never answered me. So I don't know. I don't know if it influenced the scene or not. But yeah, I did a screen capture off I didn't break any. So let's go to Jackson. So Jackson comes home. He comes home in one piece, at least physically. I think he was deeply changed by the war. Even Varley, he and Varley didn't really get along before, although nobody got along with Varley a lot of the time. But Varley, when he went over in 1918, he spent a lot of time in London with Jackson. And he writes home to his wife, and he talks about Jackson's different. He's a frailer person. He didn't think he could survive another trip back to the front. You could see that in him right away. But Jackson comes back, and MacDonald and Elizabeth, MacDonald especially calls him the general, because Jackson is going to get them organized. They're going to have a group. They're going to do this show. Harris, because of his theosophic mysticism, I think wanted 7, because it's the number. You have to have 7 people. And so they had to find 7 people. Thompson was dead, so they rounded up Carmichael and Franz Johnson. And after the first show, Jackson in a letter said, I don't know what Carmichael and Johnson were doing in that show. They just weren't doing anything like the rest of us were doing. Carmichael sticks with it. Johnson leaves the group and goes to teach in Winnipeg. So that was the wonderful time Franz Johnson painted with them. But anyway, they needed 7 people, so they got the 7 people. And Thompson and Jackson went off to, this is just up from where I live, the Cognition area of Georgian Bay, where he had relatives who had a cottage. And he goes up into around Fraser Channel and he paints his brains out in March and April. And this is one of the paintings he hangs in that first show. And it's called March Storm, Georgian Bay. And there's a lot of war in Jackson's first paintings when he comes home. They're not pleasant scenes. These are not, when you think about the group, people think about, the west wind, frothy waves in the sun. There's nothing like this at all. I mean, you don't want to be there. I mean, it's kind of what it looks like where I'm living now. I don't want to be there either. There's these dirty tendrils of snow squalls coming through. And that's, this is one of the first things he paints. The other one he puts in the show is First Snow Algoma. And the interesting thing about this painting was that this is the sketch he did for. We had to track this down. It ended up with Michael and I. It was in the faculty lounge at the University of Toronto. It still survived. And then this is the big canvas he produced for it. So the 2 things you notice maybe you'll notice right away, is that all the trees are burned out, which weren't in the sketch. And he's put the snow in and this smoky stuff that weren't in the sketch either. And when you look at this, you're really not sure if you're looking at fire if you're looking at snow, if you're looking at ash, it's very much a war painting, much like Mark's, the Mark Swollen was. The war stays with them, and these kind of burned out trees are very evocative. I mean, I know it's the north of Canada, but it's not like you sketch. They're very much like maple copse. They're very much like Sanctuary of Wood, where he was wounded. And they come up over and over again in his work through the rest of his life. I don't think the war ever really left Avery Jackson. And I think if there is a signature painting for Jackson, this one's in Michael. And I think it's it. I think it's one of his finest works. And I can close it on that is really that I think Jackson really had done his best stuff by 1922, 23. He was 40 then. That's still not old for an artist, but the war really kicked him into some difficult, to say the least, situations of how do I paint this, how do I depict it, what decisions do I make, what process am I going to have to use, this whole sketching first, going back to the studio. It forces him to do things he hadn't had to do before, and I think actually a lot of his very best work was his war work, and unfortunately most of it is sitting in the basement of the Canadian War Museum because there's nowhere to hang it. It's all in storage with all the other war art that was created with Beaverbrook's program. Because the idea was they were going to, after the war, they were going to build this big museum in Ottawa and put it all in. Well, after the war, there was no money in Canada to build giant art museums, so it just went into storage. And stuff comes out, sometimes it gets rotated into display at maybe the Juno Center. But when I first started working on this book, I got the War Museum to let me come in and look at the collection. And there's these enormous metal racks, like in any big gallery collection, but they just go on forever. And you're pulling these racks open, and it's astonishing the stuff that is hanging in that basement on these racks. He did about 39 paintings, and I think most of them are sitting on those racks, just not seen. And there's so many other. I mean, Franz Johnson did some amazing aerial paintings under commission for the war program. He must have had a camera. He took them from flight trainers, flying over the Niagara Peninsula. But you just look at these paintings and work on them. It's like so unfortunately, I give these talks and people go, where can I see the paintings? Well, apart from the plates in the book, until they do another show or something, they're just not available. So I think I covered off everything, and I'm up to 8 o'clock. His brother Bill did live. He was actually the people that organized the 14th Battalion were some of the most moneyed people in Montreal, and they extricated him from the army and got him sent back to Montreal in 1915 so he could manage the books of the trust company. I don't know how they did it. Well, they did it because they were powerful people. He got out, but he lost David Ward Clement, which was one of his a young cousin who was at the COG machine. I mean, I read about him quite a bit. He volunteers as a very bright, eager young man. He ends up transferring to the Flying Corps. He's killed in action December 17. Paul Hayward was another cousin. The very first time he goes into action is a diversionary battle at Lièvre. It was supposed to draw away German attention from Hill 70. They were planning to do, and it was a complete waste of people because the attack for Hill 70 didn't even happen for 3 weeks. Hayward was wounded in probably the opening minutes of the action, and he was never the same person. His medical record is just someone who's completely shattered mentally, and he'll be dead at 29. He probably drank himself to death when he got home. Lord Harris, his brother, was killed in action in February 1918 as an officer of the British. They never found his body. Most of them, I think, as I've been told, if you go there and you see the big cemeteries and stuff, I think something like 80% of the people who were killed, the bodies were never recovered. So we see a lot of, memorials, but people just disappeared. They were atomized, in the shelling. So for Harris had a nervous breakdown. He was his only brother. Harris had very specific ideas about soil and blood and belonging and the fact that his brother had just vanished like this just about finished him. And the war in my closing, I say the war for the Group of Seven was such a near-run thing because Jackson really could have been killed in action, and he wasn't. Lord Harris almost went crazy because he lost his brother. Arthur Lismer went to Halifax to run a school, an art school, and then this munition ship blew up, as you may have heard. In December 1917, killed 2,000 people. Didn't kill him, but damaged the school. The school got turned into a place to store coffins, and that was the end of his teaching in Halifax. J.H. MacDonald had a stroke in the fall of 1917. He never really fully recovered from a stroke, and he would die in 1932, and that was the end of the group. It was like John Bonham dying in Led Zeppelin. You don't have MacDonald anymore, and there's no Group 7. So they all, and then they lost Thompson. Thompson was the one they really thought was the grand man who was going to lead them forward. And Jackson really regretted that Thompson never got overseas as an artist, because he thought the things that Thompson could have done with what was going on here, and he never got a chance. So I'll leave it at that, and I think the fights are going to start. Oh, wait, it's 8:01, so it's going to be the anthem booing. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yes?
I'm glad you mentioned Clement.
Yeah.
I'm over here from Kitchener, and
Right.
we're quite proud of Jackson's connection with
Yes.
Kitchener.
With the
Like the
Battalion.
Woldies and the Clements, and the
Yes.
write-ups of that.
Yeah.
And that cottage you mentioned up in
Yes.
the top part of Georgian Bay there.
Yeah.
I wonder if any of the pictures you did before the war had any resemblance to this with trees, because those areas were
No,
full of
because,
forest
well,
fires
actually,
as
we
well.
don't know, because, well, the ones I've seen, no. And I've taken some of the paintings out, because people don't kind of care about that, just in a military thing. But one of the problems we have with, actually, there's a great letter from Jackson I normally show. The first time he went to Georgian Bay, he went with the Clements, because they were his cousins. And they went to this cottage just up from where I am, in the cog machine. And he writes his mother home, letter to his mother home, and he says, well, I'm chopping wood, I'm not the great social, success, sort of thing, but there's nothing, but he basically says there's nothing to paint. It's just a bunch of scrabbly trees and bare rock. It's a great place to swim and fish, but there's nothing quite paintable. And you read this letter and you go, this is a founding figure of the Group of 7 who was going to make this area absolutely iconic, in our understanding of what art in Canada is. And the first time he sees it, he has no idea what to do with it. So it's not until 1913 that he really produces some paintings out of Georgian Bay that survive, that look like, where the group is going to go with them. But the other problem we have with Jackson is he destroyed so much early work. He had no compunctions about burning stuff. It wasn't selling, it just went in the furnace. So unless the family gave away things like, there were presents for the weddings and things like that that managed to survive, he burned an incredible amount of stuff. One of the things big things he destroyed was at the end of the war. I'm trying to keep this brief. When he was in Halifax, the sister ship of the Titanic was being used as a transport. Was bringing the troops home, and he wanted to go down and see Lisbon and paint the Olympic coming in. So he did, but he was discharged from the Army April 1919, and he didn't do the painting until after. And in Jackson's mind, because he was paid incredibly badly compared to everybody else that went in from Canada, like Bill Beattie got $4,500 as a painter, extraordinary amount of money. Jackson's getting maybe $170 on top of his military pay for all he did. He didn't own any of the work, it all went to the collection. But this one, he hadn't painted yet. I'm out of the Army, so as far as I'm concerned, it's my painting. And I'm going to do it. So he paints this big canvas of the Olympic in camouflage. And the Canadian War Projects wants it for the Canadian show of the war art. So it's sure, he loans it to them, lets them and hang it. And then he wants them to buy it. And he wants $700 for it. He wants $250 for another harbor thing. And there's letters in the organization saying, really, Jackson's been pretty badly dealt with. We should find $1,000 and buy the 2 paintings. Well, they don't. They don't buy the paintings. So the smaller painting of the ships goes to the Tate Gallery in London. It's sold. The other one, the big one of the Olympic, it's shipped back to a studio. It just sits around getting in the way, and he finally just tears it off and throws it in the fire. And so we have one picture of it, in black and white from the catalog and something. That's the only one I saw. That's a really long way to ask you, did he paint like that? We don't know. But he didn't paint the burnt out stuff. Not in the comic machine. It was more the rock and pine sort of thing. But it's interesting, the breakouts, because the big crops were very big up in Penetang, but you stayed with them a lot too. And, I didn't know them. Anybody else? Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering if, like you said, you corresponded a lot. Did you ever sketch in this correspondence?
Sometimes there's just little things,
Yeah.
very small things. There's things like, when he was in France, you realize reading these letters that his sister painted, and so did his mother. We don't have anything from them. And they didn't go on and be an artist like him because they weren't a guy, but he did try to convince his sister that you should come and study at the Julian. So what she did, we don't know. But my point on that is there is a letter where he draws his paint box. He inks it in and shows his mom, this is what I'm using. It's really quite nice to have. And I can get you one if you want, and I can have it sent home. So, but they're really just kind of little dribbling things like that. They're not, they're not works that you would consider, art. Yes?
I get the feeling these guys were painting out their trauma in a lot of sense.
Afterwards?
Hanging around.
Yeah. With Jackson, there's no question. I don't think he ever, I don't know how he would. I mean, the number of people he lost and what he went through himself is just horrendous. It's funny, as a total aside, when my father died 2 years ago, it was very late in his life when he told me that his own father he was weakened by the war. That's how he put it. I didn't know my grandfather very well. He died when I was 4, but he never had a steady job. He came home from being a soldier, and he was a clerk at a hardware store. We were dirt poor in Hamilton. He's a very nice man, but he just never ever recovered. And I think a lot of people that came back from that war just never recovered from it. Yes.
Your interest in military history, do you
Yes.
know if there's sketches or artists doing Ukraine right now?
I don't know. I honestly don't know.
It just sort of brings up that.
Because we did it in the Second World War. We sent artists again, and it's always a very, you say, well, why are we sending painters? Because we've got cameras, And it was the same issue in the First World War. There was photography done, but it was actually very restricted what they could show. But there was still this idea that we need artists to interpret this thing going on. And the fact that it would be a priority to send
We have
artists.
TV now.
Yeah. I don't know what Ukraine is doing.
Did they continue with it, let's say, Korea, the rest of the wars?
That's a good question. I don't know. I just know they went up to the Second World War because Alf Colville was one of the painters for that. Did some marvelous stuff. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much.
So, you should have shown where can we get your book?
Well, I have 5 in the car, but I didn't bring them in. I didn't want to fight. That's what it is. Yeah, you can get it off Amazon. Lots of plates. So yes, it's easily available. You can order on Amazon if you're okay with Amazon, and it's shipped to your house, or you can go to your local bookstore and say, "Please order me this," and they'll get one for you. So it's published by McGill Queens, distributed by U2 Press. So it's great.
So our next military lecture is on March 20th, and we actually, this is a bit of a coup for me, I think. Lieutenant Colonel Miguel Ortiz Sosa is the commanding officer of the Buffalo Field Regiment, is going to talk about being in Gunnerstown and the military presence in the West. I think it's going to be a fantastic talk. So hopefully you can come out in March for that. And also, if you're interested in these lectures, you can sign up for our email list at the front desk. And we also have a survey of just comments if you have any interest or other topics just outside the door. So if you have any comments, you can fill out the survey. And hopefully we see you back here again next month. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go Canada, pick up.